They grew up as brothers, trained together, bled together, swore they'd never raise weapons against each other. But in ancient Ireland, fate didn't care about promises. This is the story of Ferdia and Cú Chulainn, two warriors who loved each other like family, forced by queens and gods to meet at a river ford where only one would walk away. Before we continue, hit subscribe. This channel uncovers the darkest and most fascinating parts of history they never taught you in school. Trust me, you'll want to stay for this one. Picture Iron Age Ireland, a world of mist-covered hills and warrior clans, where a man's worth was measured in cattle raids and combat skill. Ferdia mac Domain was the son of a minor noble, tall and strong even as a youth. Cú Chulainn, born Setanta, was the nephew of Ulster's king, already marked by prophecy as someone destined for greatness and early death. They met at Scahawk's training camp in Alba, where we now call Scotland. Scahawk was a legendary warrior woman who ran something between a military academy and a death factory. Young men came from across the Celtic world to learn from her, and most didn't survive the training. But Ferdia and Cú Chulainn did more than survive. They excelled. They sparred together every dawn, pushing each other to the edge of exhaustion. When one stumbled, the other caught him. When one doubted, the other reminded him why they'd come. At night around the fire, they talked about the future, the battles they'd fight, the songs bards would sing about them, the families they'd have. They'd become foster brothers, a bond in Celtic society more sacred than blood. They swore an oath never to fight each other, no matter what kings or queens commanded. Scahawk taught them secret techniques. The salmon leap, a jumping attack that could clear impossible distances. The gay bolg, a barbed spear that entered as 1 point but opened into 30 inside the body, making death certain and agonizing. She taught them that true warriors didn't just kill, they understood that every death carried weight, that glory always had a price. Years after training, they left as brothers in all but name. Ferdia returned to Connacht in the west. Cú Chulainn went home to Ulster in the north. They promised to meet again in peacetime, at festivals and celebrations, never on the battlefield. The gods, if they were listening, must have laughed. Queen Maeve of Connacht was not a woman who accepted the word no. She was cunning, ruthless, and driven by pride that bordered on madness. When she discovered that Ulster possessed a magnificent brown bull, the finest in all Ireland, while she only owned a white one, it became an obsession. It wasn't about cattle, it was about power, about proving that no kingdom was her equal. So she assembled an army, warriors from all the provinces except Ulster, and marched north to take the bull by force. This should have been a straightforward invasion, but Maeve had unknowingly timed her attack during Ulster's curse. The vengeful goddess had decreed that in times of greatest need, all Ulster warriors would be struck with the pains of childbirth, leaving them helpless for days, all except one, Cú Chulainn, because his divine parentage was immune to the curse. So this 17-year-old warrior stood alone at the border of Ulster, facing an entire army. And because of ancient laws, Maeve couldn't simply swarm him with soldiers. She had to send champions one at a time to single combat at the ford. For weeks, Cú Chulainn killed them. The army watched him with growing horror and respect. Maeve's champions began refusing to face him. Her army's morale crumbled. She needed someone who could match Cú Chulainn's skill, someone who knew his techniques, his weaknesses. She needed Ferdia. When Maeve's messengers first came to Ferdia, he refused immediately. But Maeve didn't become queen by accepting refusal. She sent her messengers back again and again, each time with new arguments, new pressures, new threats. Ferdia held firm. Duty meant nothing compared to brotherhood. Then came the bribes, land, gold, position, even Maeve's own daughter in marriage. Wealth beyond imagination, all his if he'd just stand at that ford. Still, Ferdia refused. no amount of treasure was worth his brother's life. Finally, Maeve played her cruelest card. She sent her poets and satirists, the men whose words could destroy a reputation forever. In Celtic society, a warrior's honor was everything. Without it, you were nothing, not just to others, but to yourself. The satirists began their work. They spread songs through the camp questioning Ferdia's courage. He hides behind his fears because he fears Cú Chulainn. He talks of brotherhood to mask cowardice. They composed verses that would be remembered for generations, branding Ferdia as the warrior who trembled, who chose shame over glory. Ferdia felt it happening, his name turning to poison, his reputation crumbling. Even his own warriors began looking at him differently. One night, alone in his tent, Ferdia faced an impossible choice. If he refused, he'd live the rest of his days as a coward, shunned and mocked, his honor destroyed. But if he accepted, he'd have to kill the person he loved most in the world, or be killed by him. Celtic culture left no room for this kind of dilemma. A warrior without honor wasn't a warrior. He was already dead. The next morning, Ferdia walked into Maeve's tent and accepted. Not because he wanted to fight, not because he believed in her cause, but because she'd left him no choice that felt survivable. When Cú Chulainn saw Ferdia approaching the far side of the ford, he didn't reach for his weapons. He waded into the water, arms open, a smile breaking across his exhausted face. Ferdia stopped at the water's edge. Chulainn's smile died. He stated his business, and it was recorded that their exchange was deeply emotional. They pleaded with each other not to fight, and both expressed grief, loyalty, and regret over what they were forced to do. They stood on opposite sides of the water, the space between them suddenly vast as an ocean. The first day's fighting was almost gentle, if such a word can apply to combat. They used light weapons, testing each other, neither committing to killing blows. When evening came, they stopped by mutual agreement. They embraced, shared food, and even sent healing herbs to each other's wounds. That night, they talked across the ford like the old days at Skahak's camp, about training, about their families, about everything except what tomorrow would bring. When they finally fell silent, they slept on opposite banks, each listening to the other's breathing in the darkness. The second day was harder. They fought with heavier weapons, drawing real blood. The strikes came faster and defenses more desperate, but still, at day's end, they met in the middle. Ferdia dressed Cú Chulainn's wounds. Cú Chulainn shared his food. They were trying to pretend that when the sun rose, they wouldn't have to finish what they started. The third day began differently. When Ferdia arrived, he wore his horn-skinned armor, a legendary piece said to be impenetrable. Cú Chulainn saw the armor and understood. The time for gentleness had ended. They fought all morning with a ferocity that terrified the watching armies. Blood turned the ford water red. The sound of their weapons rang across the valley. Neither could gain advantage. Ferdia's armor made him nearly invincible, but Cú Chulainn's speed kept him alive. By afternoon, both were stumbling, wounded in a dozen places, exhausted beyond measure, but neither would yield. Then Cú Chulainn made a decision that he would regret for the rest of his life. He called for the Gaebolg. The Gaebolg wasn't meant for honorable combat. Skahak had taught them this weapon in secret, making them swear to use it only in the most dire circumstances. It was delivered not by hand, but by foot, thrust upward through water into an opponent's body from below. Ferdia knew about the Gaebolg. They trained with it together, but in the chaos of combat, in his exhaustion and pain, he didn't see it coming until too late. Cú Chulainn dove forward, seeming to stumble. Ferdia moved to capitalize on the opening, and at that moment, Cú Chulainn kicked the Gaebolg upward through the water. It entered where Ferdia's armor didn't protect, and once inside, it opened into 30 barbs, shredding everything. Ferdia staggered, looked down, looked at Cú Chulainn. There was no anger in his eyes, just sadness. Cú Chulainn caught him before he went under. He dragged Ferdia to the north bank into Ulster territory so the Connacht army couldn't claim his body. He held his friend as the light faded from his eyes. The oldest versions of this story say Cú Chulainn's grief was so profound that his warp spasm came over him, the battle rage that transformed him into something monstrous. But this time it wasn't rage at enemies, it was rage at the gods, at fate, at Maeve, at himself. He carried Ferdia's body away from the ford and sat with it for hours, talking to a corpse about the future they'd planned, and one they would never have now. His own army approached cautiously, afraid to interrupt. When they finally coaxed him away, they said Cú Chulainn looked like he'd aged decades in a single afternoon. The war continued. Cú Chulainn kept fighting. He eventually won, in the sense that Ulster survived and Maeve retreated. But anyone who saw him after Ferdia's death said something had broken inside the young warrior. He still fought brilliantly, still won, but the joy was gone. He was a weapon now, nothing more. And what about the women who started it all? In the end, Queen Maeve succeeded in stealing the bull, but her victory was hollow. It was brought back to Connacht and placed with the white-horned bull of Cúisnge. The two bulls, symbols of their owner's pride, were set loose together. They fought a brutal, earth-shaking battle across Ireland. In the end, the brown bull killed the white bull, but it was terribly wounded. Maddened and bleeding, it wandered back toward Ulster and died from exhaustion and its wounds. Queen Maeve's pride led her to ruin, and her greed destroyed everything she sought to possess. Years after the cattle raid, an enemy finally struck her down with a single stone as she bathed, ending the life of Ireland's most cunning and restless queen. Here's what makes this story so devastating. Ferdia and Cú Chulainn were both right. Ferdia was right that in his culture, at that moment, refusing to fight meant death of honor that felt worse than physical death. He was right that Maeve had backed him into a corner with no good options. He made the only choice that let him keep his sense of self. Cú Chulainn was right that no cause was worth killing your brother. He was right that they should have found another way. He was right to beg Ferdia to walk away, but neither could bridge the gap between these two truths. And that's the tragedy, not that one was a villain and one a hero, but that two good men were destroyed by forces beyond their control, by a queen's manipulation, by cultural expectations that allowed no space for love to outweigh duty among warriors. The story asks us, what do you do when all your choices are wrong? When keeping your honor means losing your soul? When duty demands you destroy what you love most? Ferdia chose honor over life. Cú Chulainn chose duty over brotherhood. Both paid in ways that made their survival feel like punishment. The Táin Bó Cúailnge, the cattle raid of Cooley, is Ireland's oldest epic. It's been told for 3,000 years, passed from bards to monks to scholars to modern readers. And Ferdia's death remains at its emotional core, the moment when the story stops being about war and becomes about the cost of being human. Today, you can still visit Ardee in County Louth, where tradition says the duel took place. There's a ford there, much smaller, just a stream really. Stand there on a quiet morning and you can almost hear it. Two warriors who loved each other, meeting where the water runs red, where brotherhood dies and legend is born. So what do you think? Could Ferdia have walked away? Should Cú Chulainn have refused to fight? Or were they both trapped from the moment Maeve decided she wanted that bull? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, forgotten myths that cut to the heart of what it means to be human, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching this one. I'll see you in the next story.